All right, is everyone good with starting? Okay. Moving to SCTV, we'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. Welcome to the June 18th regular meeting of the Board of Finance. Thank you to Simsbury Community Television for filming. Please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Joining us tonight, we have Town Manager Mark Nelson and First Selectwoman Wendy Maxtutis. Welcome, and of course we have Director of Finance Amy Merritt. Just a quick update, Wendy shared a link to the cost legislative update for members of our board, and I did have an opportunity to log on. A couple of key takeaways from there. Keith Fanhoff's big takeaway was that he thought towns should prepare for state aid reductions in non-education funding beginning next February or a year after that, based on his review of the current budget situation. The other takeaway is that there was a new law passed on the non-lapsing fund that we use for the Board of Education. That law has changed. So if that law gets signed, which we anticipate it will, boards of eds may now contribute to the non-lapsing fund without approvals from the Board of Finance, and they may now spend from that fund without approvals from the Board of Finance. So that will cause us to need to update our policies, and Amy's aware of that and is on top of it and is already reaching out to council. That will impact our transfer policy and obviously our non-lapsing policy, so we'll make those updates later. Mike had the opportunity to participate as our representative at the housing subcommittee meeting, and I would give Mike an opportunity to just give us an update.
Quickly, on May 27th, the Simsbury Housing Policy Advisory Committee met at the library and discussed 25 housing affordability strategies, ideas, and policies from a list of 75 that were generated by stakeholders in various boards in the town. With the goal of prioritizing a much smaller list to use in a framework to be distributed to the various boards in town from the committee. And the next meeting is on Wednesday, June 26th.
Thank you. Todd, congratulations to Todd. He was recently elected chair of the retirement subcommittee.
Yeah.
I didn't.
Tough election.
And Heather is the vice chair, who was also elected, so congratulations to Heather. Todd, we did have a meeting in September. I didn't know if you had any updates you wanted to share. The information is provided online and folks can read those, but anything that struck you?
No, I mean, we went through, they set their agenda up quarterly with different topics. Off the top of my head, I can't remember what this particular quarter was, but they just go through it's a very diligent review of all the different investments that we have, and I think they make very conservative picks, and they point out things that they're watching, and make sure that over time, anything that's not going in a way that we want it to, they make changes, but they do a really good job.
And no issues of concern at this point?
No, nothing from my standpoint.
Okay, great. We'll move on to the finance director's report. Once again, Amy, thank you for this update. I think each time you do it, it gets better and better, really comprehensive and very helpful. So why don't you walk us through what you have, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Sure. So under the approved supplemental appropriations, you'll see that there's that new line item there for the Simsbury Meadows Field drainage repair for the $50,000. You all had a special meeting on this, and then the Board of Selectmen subsequently approved it. So that was added to our supplemental appropriations list to increase the total supplemental appropriations to $181,000 or 0.15% of the fiscal year 24 adopted budget. I won't take you through the grants and awards. Under the savings initiatives, I just wanted to point out the police one where we extended the contract for a multi-year period. It's $273,000 in savings over the term of the agreement. So this is something that we haven't typically done in the past, and Mark can speak more to how it came to be. I'm not sure if it was his initiative or the chief's, but this is something that we've done more on the Board of Education side of things to commit to longer term contracts and put some special governmental insertion writing in there that has to be approved by the boards every year, and to try to achieve those savings. Any questions on the savings initiatives before I go on?
Just Mark, you gave me this update, but can you share with the board that the contract contains the escape clause that's subject to annual appropriation by the Board of Finance so that we're in compliance with appropriation law?
That's right, Chair. Yeah, thanks for that. The town attorney made sure that was in the agreement from Axon. And then after our conversation, we also slightly amended the Board of Selectmen motion to make it clear as well that the approval was conditioned upon appropriations by both their board, your board, in the budget process every year. So on an annualized basis, it's not a huge savings, but we are looking at some of these longer term contracts to see if we can squeeze the sponge a little bit, and the chief was a strong advocate. This also allowed us to add some LPR, some license plate readers. So it also, in addition to saving some money, it added an important resource to PD, so.
I have a couple more, but do folks have any questions on the savings initiatives? Mark, one thing first of all, congratulations on the savings for the town hall parking lot project. It's $100,000, well done. Can you talk about how that works? Is that being paid for just with standard salary, or is that overtime? And if it's overtime, is that being charged to the capital project or the operating budget?
Great question. It's overtime, largely on Saturdays. We're able to do some of this work ourselves. It's coming out of the project, not operating. And it is, I won't say significantly, but it's cheaper than were we to use the GC, the general contractor, to do this. So Tom Roy has been monitoring it well. And I should thank the team that's been doing the overtime work on Saturdays to help keep this moving forward. So far, we're excited that it's almost on time, so just a little behind schedule.
And where will those savings go? That will be returned to capital reserve?
Yep.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right, Amy, you wanna keep us moving?
Sure. The Board of Finance follow-up items, I just wanted to touch base on the tax appeals. You all had asked for the budgeted $5 million for fiscal year '24 and where we came in within tax appeals due to the reval year. Our actual appeals so far are about $5.7 million and translated into tax dollars above and beyond the $5 million that we had already accounted for during the budget season. It's about a $16,000 decrease in taxes. There are still 10 appeals open in litigation, and speaking with the assessor, she doesn't feel that any of those 10 appeals will have a material effect beyond what's already been settled. So we'll keep an eye on those and let you know if anything major comes out of that. And then with regards to, since I was already checking on the 22 grand list, I had her run the numbers on the 23 grand list for fiscal year 25 upcoming. We had budgeted about a little over $1 million in tax appeals. And currently right now it's about $1.2 million. So Francine's estimate was super close. We're only about $4,000 off in tax dollars there.
Please extend our thanks to her. Those were great estimates. She did a good job with that.
Yeah, she did a nice job with that. The tax relief programs is just in progress right now. I guess there's more coming on that in future weeks as the meetings are happening. Oh, and then the other thing I wanted to point out, the compensation classification study, which we had anticipated for results in June, will be reported out to the Board of Selectmen in July.
Just before you move on to that, I did have an opportunity to speak with Mark on this, thank you. He's offered to come in and do an executive session with us on that study so that we can ask questions pending negotiation. Obviously, we don't talk about that in public audiences, it might impact negotiations. So thank you for that. That will be probably in July or August.
The assessor's office performance audit went quiet for a bit, as noted in the report. Unfortunately, our contractor was hospitalized for a short time when they were finalizing the report at the end of May. So I believe he is out of the hospital now. He reached out at the end of last week. And they're continuing to get back into finalizing the report. And then under the financial summary, under the revenues, on the page 7, you'll see about 2.6 million in excess of budget. These are your actual, savings as of this point in time. More of the same as previously reported in prior months, the investment income, increased pilot payment are the majority of your drivers there. And of course, the tax department based on the collection rate. Any questions on revenues?
I had a question on the tax collection assumption rate is, we've got the number for the tax department as a whole at 312, but that includes more than the tax collection assumption rate. Can you talk about how that breaks down?
So the majority of that is our current year taxes, our prior year taxes, the interest and lien expense, as well as the state funding for the motor vehicle reimbursement.
So normally that comes in between 600 and 900, so why are we at 3? What's
So-
going on there?
We're at 3 for now, we still have June and we typically get around $200,000 or so in June. Beyond that, if it does come in slightly low, I'll have to take a further deep dive into that. There's 2 things I would look at, so I would take a look to see for the motor vehicles. So if you all recall, and some of you weren't here when we did budget last year, during the budget process at the last minute, we had to drop our supplemental auto because the vehicle values were starting to come down. So I would take a look at that. And the other area, I would ask Francine to pull our settlement appeals from prior years that were finalized this year. So if that doesn't come into fruition, then I will pull that data for the next meeting.
And then you had mentioned the majority of the positives are interest, investment, income, and pilot. We don't budget pilot, have not in the past, and because it's very uncertain, we did check, thank you, with Martin Heft, and he recommended that we not do that again. And most towns are not, or they're now just starting to budget a little bit, but in terms of implications going forward, we've now budgeted closer to the investment income, and that pilot income may or may not be there. So that leaves us with not as much of an income margin in future years. Is that a takeaway, a fair takeaway?
I think that's fair, especially considering where the state's going with state revenues to towns. I can imagine that additional pilot money that they're receiving might be reallocated someplace else.
Okay, so that's a trend for next year's budgeting cycle that we'll monitor. Moving on to expenditures. Feel free to interrupt, guys, if you have a question.
So on the expenditure line, you'll see that we are currently within budget, under budget about 14 million at this point in time. There's one thing I wanted to point out for the Board of Education specifically. It shows that we have about 7.7 million left in budget, which sounds great because we're anticipating a deficit. But unfortunately for the new members, we have teachers that get what's called a balloon payment at the end of the year. So they don't get paid throughout the summer, we pay them upfront all at once in June. So the majority of that is going to be wiped out on June 28th when they run their final payroll. So I just wanted to point that out because it looked a little skewed. Any questions on expenditures?
Just at the Board of Education, they were optimistic that they were gonna come in on budget. Is that still a likelihood or?
So nothing has come to fruition as far as special education, as far as derailing what we originally thought. We just looked at special education this morning actually when we were doing something related to some of the data analysis around it. And our districts are holding where we thought it was going to. So pending any other outside contracts or anything of that nature that we're not aware of, it's holding to where we thought it was going to be at this time.
So hopeful.
Where we thought is
The anticipated deficit of about $500,000 to be able to close it.
Oh, so not on budget then.
Well, yes, we're still anticipating a deficit but having offsets to reduce the deficit.
And those offsets will come from?
I forget. There were some of the I think there was an excess cost increase, there was we delayed hiring, we reallocated some of the grant money and we did a spending freeze.
So at bottom line,
Bottom line, yes, but we still have things to maneuver to cover it. I just didn't want you to think that it
but got
went
it.
away.
Yes. Thank you. And then can you speak to the over budget in the tax department? Generally, we have contingency and there's a transfer made later. Will that take care of that
Yes.
over budget? Okay.
Yeah, so that was for our tax collector that retired at the end of the year, so we have to pay out her vacation time upon her retirement, which wasn't unanticipated, so that put us in the hole. So the contingency we moved at the end of the year to cover it.
Any other questions on? Amy, I did have one question. The town office buildings are only 75%. I know it's a small number, but I thought that was,
Yeah, so I actually had to look back at the quarterly for that one. We have utility savings within the Public Works Department, which is why you'll see the lower percentages on actually the majority of the public works.
yeah.
The library, the town office buildings, buildings and maintenance, all of those are utility savings.
Makes sense. Anyone else have questions? So overall, between revenue, abundance and expenditure savings, we're still looking at year-end total positive of about 4 million?
I think so, yeah.
Great. Okay, any other questions on that?
It's 4 million what we were anticipating,
Yeah, it was about 4.2. It'll still be about there.
already left me.
And we spent a lot of that.
We spent 3.5 of it already.
Between assignments and stuff like that, so it's
Yeah, I
not
remember that.
not as exciting as it could be.
As it normally is.
Yeah. And we'll make, as a reminder to the public and this board, some of those assignments are anticipatory and they'll be made in October when the numbers are closer to finalized. Okay, moving on to, we have a supplemental appropriation. Before us, it's a request for an appropriation for the purchase of e-citation printers funded entirely by the CT Department of Transportation Highway and Safety Project Grant. Once we get our transfer and supplemental appropriation policy passed, hopefully in September or August, this is the type of supplemental appropriation that will go on a consent agenda as there is no town match and no additional operating costs and it's below 20,000. So that will just be a quick checklist in the future, but it's not in our policy yet, so it's before us today. Amy or Mark, is there anything you want to add to what has been provided to the board?
I don't think so. Just as far as I think the police department did a great job related to this. This is something that was a state mandate that they were able to get funded 100% through a grant.
I'm just curious, could you just say what an e-citation printer is?
It is some very interesting language, right? E-citation, you would think, ding, you got a ticket, right? For me, being a geek, right? So a printer, why would you need a printer, right? Here's your ticket, Mr. Eric, have a nice day. So it is literally just a thermal printer, just like at the grocery store, just mobile to fit in the cruiser, and it's nothing more than a printer. So they don't have to handwrite.
Right.
So it saves time and is more accurate and all of that fun stuff, and ties into our other system, so it's actually pretty cool that it's being paid for someone else.
I'm impressed that our director gives this answer. I was expecting them to respond.
It's a great answer.
Yeah,
Thank you.
he got it.
In a few years, it'll be QR codes. You just hold up your phone and you get the ticket and
A
it's
few years they're just gonna
It'd
go
be a tap.
ding, there's your ticket, have a nice day.
Automatically take it.
And then your phone will just pay them and yeah, and not your, well, I'm pretending this is your phone, but you get the idea.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
You shouldn't have your phone out if you're getting
That's,
but
I
well,
just
you
love
might
that
be,
it's
right?
so
You're
exciting
there
to
for a long
answer.
time. You might be telling your wife, I'm gonna be a little late. I got caught speeding on Bushy Hill.
Well, thank you, that was pretty exciting.
Sorry.
Are there any other questions from members of the board? May I have a motion effective June 18th, 2024 to approve a supplemental appropriation for the CCT Department of Transportation Highway Safety Project Grant to purchase e-citation printers in the amount of $19,133.82.
So moved.
And we have a Mike and Art, motion and second. Any further discussion?
So
All in favor?
We're approving it, hoping that it all gets paid for a grant, but it might not all, is that?
No, we've already gotten approved for the
They've
grant.
received the grant.
Mhm.
Okay.
The written submission is written like the grant is pending, but
Mhm.
they've actually received it, so
Okay,
that's
Okay,
good
'cause it says if the
clarification.
grant is, okay,
Yes.
alright.
Any other questions? We have a motion, we have a second, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries unanimously. Next on our agenda is policy review. Every year we review town policies. Amy gave us a nice copy with all the pages numbered so we can refer to the different policies. The outstanding policy that Amy and I have been working on for now a year is the transfer and supplemental appropriation policy. And the reason why it takes so long is it has to go through Board of Ed Council and Town Council, and there was recently a change in the law that I talked about, the non-lapsing, so it'll go through one more review. And then I think we'll be in pretty good shape with that. Certainly a little bit of a morass and very complicated, and not every town does it the same way. And not every state does it the same way. So we think we've reached a point where we'll take care of the legal requirements and transparency obligations that this board has in a way that's not too administratively onerous as well. So hopefully that's going to council. Has that been, it's been referred to council, so hopefully we might have it in July or August, depending on.
I asked for it for July.
Oh, wow, thank you.
We shall
Okay.
see.
Alright, thank you for that, we appreciate that.
What time did you give me?
It is more time than I gave you. And then Amy, I assume, can you ask council just to redraft the non-lapsing policy? It may be that we don't even need one at this point because it's now a law, but whatever we need to do with it, do we need to rescind the existing policy? I don't know what it is. Do folks have any questions on the policies we've presented? I don't know if folks had a time to read them, and it's okay if you haven't, this is the first look, we'll do another look in July, so if folks wanna look at them, we can go through them as well.
Sounds good.
One of the things on the investment policy, I know Art and Amy are working on capturing some of the high interest rates with slightly longer investment vehicles. And the question is, do we, and this is really more for Amy and Mark, although our board as well, do we need language on what percent of the portfolio may be invested beyond 36 months or some other time frame? A lot of towns do put that limitation in there, and I don't know what the right answer is, but I think that's something we should evaluate, so if you
Yeah, I
wanna
can
look.
reach out to surrounding or my GFOA finance directors and see what they do.
And then any limits on investments between 3 and 7 years, sometimes they do a double phase in. So just the reason why I think it's a good idea is it actually protects Mark and Amy because they have to do these investments in compliance with the policy. And I wouldn't want someone to attack them later and say, why did you do a 10-year vehicle?
Do we anticipate going that long with the investments? If the answer is I don't know yet, that's fine, I was just, I wasn't thinking that we would even get close to that, but
You know, I don't know. I was waiting to see what they brought for like specials for that. And just thinking about it just like on the fly, I know we had planned for a 1 year, but you know, given the state of the state and what goes up must come down, like maybe we do look into multi-year if they have a good rate.
And we could do sort of a, you know, like personal investment, do laddered investments where different timing for when they come through,
Right.
so that we're constantly maintaining cash
I would think that's
flow.
what we would, if we were gonna do something and say something in terms of a limitation, it would be on that and sort of how it matches our expected outflows.
Yeah, oh
Right.
yeah, for sure, which is why I wouldn't wanna do it without a recommendation from Amy or Mark, cause it
Sure.
does require a cash flow analysis and best practice, you know, see what other towns are doing. So those are the only things I had outstanding on the policy. We recently updated the OPEB and retirement a few months ago. So I think that's in pretty good shape. And if, you know, take time to read it if you want, and if there's something else we missed, we can certainly revisit that in July. Any other questions on that? We're now moving on to budget discussion. First of all, congratulations to everyone in this room who worked on the budget, looking how other towns fared during their budgets. I feel like we should be proud of the results that we got. Our board has expressed its thanks to Amy in the past, but I wanna take a moment to express it again publicly. Amy, thank you for your work on the budget. I think that really enabled us to do a smooth process and help the public understand what was being offered, and that understanding led to passage, so nicely done. Our board expressed the desire to review process and data over the summer and scheduling over the summer. Just a couple of updates before we begin. As a reminder to the public, this past year we ended with a tax increase of 4.68%, with COLA coming in at 3.2. We had some unusual challenges, but also some unusual opportunities, which helped us come to a budget that our citizens voted for. We lost the motor vehicle reimbursement, which was over $1 million. 16 towns in Connecticut were in the same situation we were. We were fortunate to have investment income soar, which sort of balanced out that deficit. We saw increased special education needs and costs that were growing, but state reimbursement decreased, and that is something that all towns across the state of Connecticut saw. We had a flat grant list, which made it a little bit more difficult. And then we addressed debt service costs in the out years by reducing capital and planned use of capital reserve to smooth the debt service spikes going into the future. So that's sort of a summary of where we ended up. You have in your papers before you where we ended up with the mill rate. And you can see that Simsbury's mill rate among the four peer comparison towns of Simsbury, Avon, Farmington, Glastonbury came in the highest. And that means our citizens are paying slightly more in taxes for a same valued home. If you go down with the lesser peer towns of West Hartford, Granby, South Windsor and Cheshire, we came in below West Hartford and South Windsor. How comparable those towns below the line are to Simsbury, I don't know, but it's a nice sort of comparison. That's one of the things we watch in terms of planning for the following year. Simsbury's budget passed by a wide margin, so congratulations on that, but it is worth noting that the rate of approval for the fiscal year 2025 budgets was lower than the 5-year average. So it passed by a wide margin but lower than average, so that's something we wanna be mindful of going forward. Avon's budget failed twice. They will be holding a third referendum, so the number you have for the Avon is tentative at this point. Canton's budget failed once and passed on the second try. And across the state, we were seeing a lot of failure, more than I've ever seen. So that was, I think, in some ways a reflection of the revaluation where there was a cost shift. Even though budgets themselves might have been going up at a reasonable level, the cost shift from the revaluation was too much for citizens to bear. And they voted quite a lot voted no on that. One process improvement that our board has discussed that Mark has already agreed to, so I just wanna let the board know. Last time during the budget, we had to give guidance to the Board of Selectmen before they had a chance to review it after Mark's budget came in when we knew. We wanna make sure that we give the Board of Selectmen the same time to review the budget that we give to the Board of Education. And one way to do that is for Mark to present his budget just 2 weeks or maybe 3 weeks earlier, just move the schedule up. So then when it comes to us, if there are adjustments we need to make, we can say, Board of Selectmen, come back with a new number like we do with the Board of Education. It's a little bit more respectful of the process. And so thank you, Mark, for working with us on that.
Our pleasure.
At the end of the day, I think the budget for most citizens is really about, it's pretty simple. I think Todd said it well to me earlier in the day. It's really about what am I getting and what does it cost me? And can I afford this and am I willing to pay it? And so everything we do sort of goes to that endpoint of taxes. But the question I think our Wallace really raised and I think brought to a good point of discussion for this board is how do we convey how we give the guidance. We give guidance often in October or November when we have limited information and the information changes over time. we give guidance based on objective facts and subjective judgments. And how do we convey how we do that? I think, from time immemorial, boards of finances have looked at inflation and grand list growth as sort of the key indicators of how much revenue we have. And they've looked at other factors like mandates, priorities, citizen sentiment, all the other things that go into it. We often get asked, why isn't it just a formula? And it's not, because it's local government, because local government is unlike a business. We pay for things that businesses would never invest in because they don't generate a profit. And they're on scale, so no one would do that individually. So it's a different thing, but we'll be talking about that in just a minute. But I did wanna give folks sort of approach it with 3 general questions, and we'll get feedback from everyone as we go through it. But we wanted to start with getting members' views on what worked and where they'd like to see process improvements. Discuss how to determine and communicate guidance at different points in the process, and I'm gonna let Art Wallace sort of lead that discussion, or I'll turn to him first as we move into that discussion, and then get thoughts on information the Board of Finance would like to review in the summer, and think broad picture, 10-year look back, 5-year projections to the extent we can. And what information would be helpful as we think about budgets generally, what trends are we watching, what do we care about? And hopefully get some feedback from the superintendent and the Board of Ed as to what they think we should look at, and Mark and Wendy as to what we should look at. So I wanted to start with sort of getting members' views on just generally what worked and where do we wanna see improvements.
Chair, one quick question before we jump in.
Yeah.
The numbers that we have on this page for Avon, does that reflect their most recent budget, which was not accepted?
Yes,
Okay, I just wanted to understand that. Okay,
so that's gonna be very tentative, right?
got it. Thank you.
Well, Madam Chair, I guess I've seen, now the point I've seen almost as many as you have of these go through. And I think one of the important things that we've hit on that works in this town is firm guidance. I mean, the other boards have to have an idea where we need to come in. It's not a final number, but it's a range, and we have discussed that amongst ourselves and been able to give guidance. I think that has been helpful. To the extent that we can, I think it's helped that we've gone back to those boards and said, you do it, you do the cuts, you arrange this. I mean, if we have to, we will, but it's much healthier if you go back to the Board of Education and say, you're here, our guidance is here, you deal with the gap rather than have us do it. And when that works, I think it's so much healthier. I just observe that. Another one is that I think this board did listen respectfully to the community. As you say, all communities are different. Not every community has a flower bridge. I'm serious. I mean, all communities have different things of special interest to them. And we had a past big increase the year before. Not every town did. So I think we listened respectfully and were open to those suggestions. And then finally, just you can't overdo the communication. We communicated an awful lot. I think by the time people went in to vote, they had heard everything. There were no surprises. There was nothing hidden. There were no, unknown envelopes that had to be discussed at the end. It was very open. So that's my overall perspective. I commend you. I mean, you led this with an even hand, and there are times when it got heated and you did not, and that's always helpful. I mean, I think the fact that we can respond to points made in a constructive way, and not always in the heated kind in which they were delivered is beneficial to the board. Those are my initial thoughts.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I think we communicated the right way. As I said, people really wanna know what that bottom line tax percent number that's gonna hit them. There's a ton of numbers on the sheets, we go through them all, but I think in the end, people wanna know. And I think Lisa, you lead that, you've done it for years, saying average house, this is how much in percent and dollars. I think we do a good job with that. One thing that I think we talk about a lot, but the one thing I think it gets confusing is how the capital dollars and what we do on capital impacts today. I mean, people wanna know what's gonna happen in a couple of years but you know, some of the referendums we had this year were big numbers, but a lot of those were, you know, already approved, so it was really just kind of an incremental piece within that whole thing. I think we should make sure that we emphasize that. Because a lot of the comments that we got from the public were, look at this total bucket, and a lot of that total bucket was already kind of approved, and it was just like a 400,000 out of a 2-point-something million. So I think we can emphasize that better, but also, you know, how something that we approve on the capital side today, how that impacts next year's mill rate or doesn't, but it will at some point, and what we've approved in the past, how that's impacted what we're, you know, what's happening next year, as far as the tax increase. That one I think is very complicated because there's a lot of timing issues there. But I think we did a good job, and as far as the guidance, you know, I appreciate that we came in with something and there was communication back and forth with the town and with the Board of Ed to collectively get to an answer that we could accept. May not have been the happiest answer, and we all would have liked something lower, but it was acceptable, and collectively we worked together, and I think that kind of teamwork really benefited. And I hope that the town saw that also.
Amy, other towns, I've noticed some towns do this, I don't know if we have the ability, I assume we do. They quantify the dollar amount of the capital projects, how that impacts the budget. Is that
Like the bond,
yeah,
like what we're paying for in bonds this year and the dollar value related to the capital. Yeah, we
Yeah.
can do that. It actually comes in our bond authorization.
okay, and some people, would that be helpful, or would you rather see it as the mill rate impact? We could do both.
Both.
Yeah.
Okay.
Makes sense, yeah.
We can do that.
Alright, that would be helpful, cause that might help us then show.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't had anybody tell me that in particular, but that's just
Oh, no.
one thing that is,
I've had questions on,
Yeah.
I've had a lot of questions on that, I've actually had elected officials said to me, how does this impact the operating budget and when does it
Mhm.
impact? I mean, it's confusing stuff. And we use confusing terms, we do debt service, it's like, who knows what that is, right? Unless you're in the middle of municipal, I think that's really important, I think that could really help with our communication.
yeah, I mean, I think the Latimer impact on this year's mill rate was important, and that was something that people had approved already. Had a big impact on the current budget we just voted for.
Right. And when it hits, that's sort of the
Right.
timing of the debt, and I think Amy did a really nice job sort of smoothing that timing out, so we'll be going forward, although I imagine we'll be doing some reductions in capital again this year. But much better place to begin with, so great job on that. Bert, did you have anything?
Yeah, well, you know, we're a kind of peculiar board. I've been on it 3 years now, and there's no clear, you know, the public elects the Board of Selectmen really to set the policy for how the town's gonna run and what its priorities will be. We have a town manager who also has input in that. We have a separate Board of Education to decide what's the best way to educate the students. And exactly how much interference is appropriate from us, how much we should say, this is too much, this is a bad idea, do we need a splash pad? There's no clear guidance that I'm getting about that. I try to be even-handed about it, and the thing that makes me feel best about it is getting as much information as possible about the budgets that we're evaluating. So we go to the budget workshops, they're very helpful. Actually, the one last year, not the most recent one, but the one before, or the two that I attended before that, for the Board of Selectmen, got very granular about each expenditure down to a few $1,000s from the police department on this item or that. But I found it very useful. I was grateful that this year's meeting did not go into a second day. But all things being equal, I'd rather have more information than less. I feel that we do not get that kind of information from the Board of Education, and which is 70 to 80% of the money we're going to approve. And I'd really like to see something along those lines from the Board of Education so that I can explain, we get the same speakers each year about the Board of Ed budget, and I would like to be able to respond by saying, well, actually, I understand 70% is salaries, we've gotta do this for a purpose, but I'd like to know what kind of programs we're paying for and whether they're all reasonable. So that's something I'd like to see.
Now you've attended some of the Board of Ed budget workshops.
All of them since I've been on this board.
Okay. So that is one thing members of the public can also attend, and members of this board, and they do give some information, but we can start
Some.
thinking about.
But it's not at
Okay.
the same level.
Interesting.
Of course, you get out a lot fast.
Can I raise my hand?
Yeah.
I just wanna comment and you referred to the last few years versus this year. There was a change this year in that we didn't go through department by department, which we had done before. We had each departments normally will present to the town manager before it comes to us, right, to make their case for their spending. And then they do a pared down version, or in the past had done a pared down version to us, kind of reiterating what they shared with Mark. This year Mark felt that was probably a little redundant, I don't wanna put that word in, but there was a better way to talk specifically about, capital and overall operating, things like that. So I don't know if that has anything to do with what you're saying is how the information was presented, or
I don't wanna
it was
suggest that it
fine.
wasn't helpful and that it wasn't informative, but in the past, I felt really dollar for dollar, I at least knew where the money was going and what the arguments were for the various programs. I could ask questions at the meeting, of the members of the town. I felt a little less informed this year.
Mike?
This is my third budget. They have all been a grind. Right, like two board members were like, I can't do this anymore, and left, right? I guess Derek was up for re-election. The bummer for me in all three is the voter turnout. I purposefully went out and bought pizza wearing my I voted sticker, and 4 different people asked me, what'd you vote for today? Right? Like they looked at me like I had 3 heads, and I was like, the budget? And they're like, oh, which of course led to all kinds of fun questions and all kinds of fun comments and all of that fun stuff. So I saw all of the different ways, right? I drove by the sandwich boards, I got the town emails, I received the mailing stuff that went out from the BOE, from the town, right? I noticed all of that stuff, but I can't help but wonder what else we can do to get that number, and it's at 10%, which is better than in previous years. So that's a move in the right direction, but we all collectively spend so much time on this process, right? It is months and months and months, and we have special directors specifically for the budget, right? And 2,000 people come out of 20,000 and vote for it.
So there is one suggestion that we received from Melissa Appleby, who's the director of the budget. And I'm hoping this board will support, because it will require a little extra funding. Her suggestion was that we do a mailing before the public hearing summarizing the budget, so people know what the issues are, and then one after, before referendum, reminding them. So the one after would be more limited, but more detailed at the beginning, with the hope that that will generate some interest. Mark, when we put out emails, are we using the full force of the government? Does it go out on Simsbury Rec, the library's website? Does it go out on Chamber?
Yes, but we can do much better. So in terms of our email blasts, what we're looking at now in the town manager's office is the number of subscribers who have signed up for this. And we wanna get into more of a partnership with the Board of Ed side, which has better information than we have on this side. So there's an effort afoot to do exactly what this board is suggesting, is whatever we can do to make sure that that message gets out earlier, which will require a little bit of funding, but also to synthesize a better means of electronic communication as well. And then, of course, looking ahead, there'll be the update to the town's website, which, you know, doesn't necessarily drive more users, but it could be more user friendly. It could be easier to understand. I think to the point that was just made, as we shift to ClearGov, which was approved for next year, we're starting on the capital side, and then the following year we'll phase in operating. You know, one of the benefits of ClearGov is the more transparent and more readily understandable information. I think whenever you're talking about voter turnout, it's either apathy, or maybe it's a lack of understanding, or maybe it's a combination of the two. So whatever we can do to make it easier to understand all of those numbers. I do like Melissa's idea to get 2 mailers out. It's not that expensive to do. And then I think we just continue to track this year over year. And our goal should be to have better outreach and better attendance at the budget votes. That's our goal.
I commend Michael, I mean, you're right. And perhaps we all individually, and the Board of Selectmen individually as well as collectively, and the Board of Education individually as collectively, ought to tell their constituents, this is a big deal. These are your tax dollars, and everybody take an individual role in including. And I agree. There is one good point to it, is that sometimes when you have a really high turnout, it's because people are really dissatisfied, either with the amount of taxes or because something is not included or has been included as an expenditure. And there are some voters who say, yeah, it looks okay to me. And that is a complacency that shouldn't be there, but that in some way describes the lack of controversy and the absolute necessity for me going out to vote, me the voter going out to vote. We do review this stuff very, very thoroughly, and I think we have certainly tried to have a consensus that this is a fair and reasonable budget. Now, to the extent that that discourages voting is bad, but to the extent that there are people who are pleased with the process we have, I think we need to note that. Nonetheless, I very much endorse what you're saying. I think we need to get more people participating.
Yeah, I like Melissa's idea too about get people for the public audience. They can hear what other people say, and that might help drive them. But we don't always know when the referendum's gonna be until later in the process, right?
Right.
I mean, is there a way that we can set that date, earlier? Not have an earlier date, but
Well, the challenge there, we're limited by the charter because we have to hold a public hearing, and if we need more information, we have to hold a second public hearing, and then the referendum has to be within 3 weeks of the last public hearing. So it's very hard to do, but getting the information, just I think the one substantive change where we just get Mark's and the Board of Selectmen's information earlier and have an opportunity to go back, I think will hopefully, if not eliminate, make the second hearing very minor. So that's sort of the goal there, and have the information up front and have a lot of the work done. That's one thing we can do, but it's almost impossible. I mean, we put out a tentative date, at the beginning when we plan it for the referendum. When we do our planning, if you go back and look at past ones we've done, we put public hearing, second public hearing, and then referendum tentative date. So we do that, but you're right. I mean, that's the challenge of referendums.
right, I mean, that would help. Focus more
I'm actually
people
working on, and I've been working on it for a long time and haven't walked away from it for a bit because I just need to take a fresh perspective, but an infographic on the timing of all of it that hopefully we can get on the website and distribute it in different ways electronically in the hopes that, right, cause people are like, when can I come and talk and all of that fun stuff, and yes, that information is out there, but you kind of have to dig for it a little bit. right? And I wanna just, here it is. And make it hopefully as user friendly as possible. Not that it's not user friendly now, but you gotta dig a little bit.
So for members of the public who might not know Mike, he's actually an expert on this exact thing, so he's the process and social media communication and website communication, so when he says he's working on it, it's not like me working on it. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Alright, so we have that, we're gonna go to our Wallace, and you can give an update on general, and then we'll transition into the discussion about how we communicate the process. And one of the things this board and Mark and Wendy we've talked about is sort of changing the focus. The end game is still what are the taxes and what does it mean to me, because that's what people care about. But in terms of our analysis, it's really about the tax levy. Most communities look at the tax levy, what's a reasonable increase in the tax levy for members of the public. The tax levy is the total amount we collect in taxes. The budget is the total amount we spend. Some of the money is not taxes, we call it non-tax revenue. It's the one time we use normal language. That's fees, state aid, and then the tax levy is what we have to tax for, and that's about $180 million in the town of Simsbury. And as we think about what's a reasonable to Art's and Todd's point, what's reasonable may not be what we would do or even what we like, but what's reasonable to put to the voters. And there's always a component of a inflation increase, because costs for the town go up just like they do for our homes. And then there's new growth. And how we determine that, some of that's objective data, but a lot of it is judgment. And where are the judgment points? And our information changes over time, and as our information changes, our opinion and judgment changes as it should. So how do you think about the framework, how do we talk about it, and use the framework as a jumping off point, again, to Todd's point, ultimately driving to, okay, what does it mean for me? What am I getting and what's my tax increase gonna be? So, alright, you wanna talk about sort of your general thoughts and
Sure.
then sort of dive into that?
Sure. Yeah, so I agree with a lot of what was said here. I mean, I think overall in terms of like what went well, I think there was a ton that we accomplished when you think about what was actually in the budget. I mean, there was a bunch of special interest stuff that was for a single year for me, and this was my first time going through this, to have that much special interest stuff coming through and be inside of 5%. And then other things like, I know we did some things from a town manager perspective as well, so a lot of collaboration. I feel like a lot of transparency was in the process, which is great. I think from a finance perspective, I think we also tried to go the extra mile and meet everyone where they were trying to do some things by looking a little bit closer at some of the things we can, either through assumptions or as we talked about earlier, trying to lock in a higher interest rate, whatever it is. So I think a lot of creativity there, which is great. To me, the thing that, and it sort of leads to what Lisa was just talking about, is it still bugs me, certain things, right? So we have a tax, our mill rate essentially is about 10% higher than Avon, right? When I look at the last couple of years, we've had some pretty significant tax increases that we've asked for. We did put a lot in a single year this past year, right? And the good side is, hey, we stayed inside of 5%, but we put a lot in 1 year. And so my biggest thing is, as much as I realize guidance is tricky and numbers change, I feel like we owe it to the taxpayers to really be trying to drive towards inflation plus grand list growth. That just seems like such a basic thing for us, and for us to have that discipline earlier in the process, as much as COLA moves around and different things move around, and obviously it's not a business, to your point, Lisa, so there's just needs of the town. But I feel like there's always, it's sort of circular to me, because if you don't have the discipline and you don't know what you're shooting for, it's easy to say, well, there was this other thing, that now this year it's special ed, next year it'll be whatever it is. And so I feel like doing some things that have us earlier in the process know what those numbers need to really be. And perhaps also thinking about having more options. I felt like as we went down the stretch, I was surprised on certain expenditures that were pretty significant that we hadn't thought about 2 or 3 options. And maybe we had, and it was already in the background and we had settled on one. I just don't know that it became public that we had done that. And so in some ways 468, that's a good number. Like in some ways I was one of the people that said, let's get it inside of 5. And when I think our first cut when we were looking at things was 7+, right? So So in some ways, I feel like we got to a livable number, but when I look at some of those other attributes, I feel like there's more we probably need to do on behalf of the taxpayers to drive some discipline and what we're solving for sooner. And what that doesn't mean, just to be clear, because I feel like we've had a few sidebar conversations on this, it doesn't mean it's completely formulaic. It doesn't mean that you're always gonna be inflation plus grand list, but we should have really good reasons when we're not. And even when there are moving pieces, like that doesn't help the average person. We could say the state dropped some aid or whatever it is. Yeah, but someone's still gonna have to pay the extra money, right? So I think making sure that we feel really good about that process and having it start earlier. I'd love to almost have gotten one more iteration out of our process, because I think we could have gotten to an even better place. Because I see some towns that got to 3% plus type things, which feels like the numbers I'd be, hoping that we could shoot for. So I'll stop there, but I don't think it has to be rocket science. What I don't wanna do is ruin the collaboration either, because I think we've got a lot of really good communication that happens in the process as well. So this is from the person that first time through, so take all that with a grain of salt, but those would be some of my reactions and thoughts for the coming year.
Do you have the ability to pull up the machine, or are we unconnected?
I think I can.
Just while we're doing that, I agree, and if we don't have that, I will say idealism, and coming in to try to do that, we're falling behind. We've got to think that way. The two hard points that kind of come and sort of whack us on the side of the head are obvious. Labor negotiation for salaries. And secondly, things which happen that are not predictable or great, like a building, a major school finally has had it.
Sure.
And it falls apart sooner than we had thought, and it doesn't go at a certain percentage at a certain grade level so you can participate. I thank you, I like that perspective. But those are two of the hard knocks that come and make bumps in the road for us as we try to do that.
And I think that's fair, which is why I'd say two things to that. One, our job, there's people involved here and they're not formulas, so we have to make decisions. But I would say over long periods of time, inflation plus grand list is still a good thing. So you can have bumps in the road all day. Like it's kind of like our own budgets, right? There are years where you had to replace your roof or your furnace or whatever it is. But you hope that over time you know what your average is, right? You know that you're funding to an average. And I have a hard time making sense to tell. I always say I'm gonna see someone in Fitzgerald's rule, right? So what would I say to someone that over time you should expect you're gonna be grand list plus inflation plus something else, right? I don't have a great reason why I would say that should happen over long periods of time. So I totally get your point and I respect that, and I think we're running a town here and there are some lumpy things that are gonna come through. We just owe it to the taxpayers though to really push on that stuff to over periods of time be able to say, we're going through the same thing you are, because you're probably gonna feel the grand list figures itself out, that piece, but you're gonna feel inflation. You're probably gonna get inflation for your raises, right? So the other thing I think that comes with that is we do have a lot of special interests in this town. I mean, we saw them all, like not all of them, but we saw a bunch of them this year. We do have a Flower Bridge, as you mentioned, Art. We've got a PAC, we have all these other things, which in some ways makes our town, a great town. It's the reason why I live in this town. It's I have 3 kids in the school system, I always mention. I mean, there's a reason why we're here. But at the same time, how much of that difference do you wanna continue to fund? Like what if we're 10% over Avon now, what if we were 12, what if we were 15? At what point do you say, we're not having our taxpayers pay for the things that they're actually getting value out of? So again, I think it needs to be taken with the right perspective, because there's a lot of great things that happen. We live in a great town, you have to pay for these things, but I feel like we owe something back to continue to push on and try to get to that level of increases.
And can you pull up that document I sent, just pull the analysis tab? This is something I do wanna thank Art for working on. A lot of states across the nation do start with the tax levy. Can you make that 100% bigger? Yeah, thank you. So this is kind of what we do, although we have generally focused on the tax increase or budget increases. But if you focus on the tax levy, you incorporate both. Just as a reminder to the public, the tax levy is net after non-tax revenue. It's what we have to raise by taxes. The budget itself was about 122. So if you start with last year's tax levy and you say, okay, what's the rate of inflation? That's the first decision point. Rate of inflation, you think that's an objective data. It's not. CPI is often different than COLA, is often different than other rates of inflation. So our first point of decision will be what is the inflation rate we're gonna sort of think about. And it will change every year. You know, when it was 8.7, we did say go ahead and increase your budgets by 8.7, right? That would be Massachusetts says, yeah, you know, rate of inflation is 2.5 period. That's it. That's what you get. But so that will be a decision point, an inflection point. And then the new grand list growth, I think, again, congratulations to Amy on the model you developed, because if you look in the model under the grand list, she puts in every year, what does that translate into dollars? Next year, we're looking at about $950, I think it's a little lower, when you corrected what I sent you, but about $950. And if you add those two together, you get a new tax levy of 112,980, right? And then you say, okay, that's how much money is out there. But to Art's point, some years you might see that $950 and go, you know what, our mill rate is so much higher than our peer towns. We need to apply that to tax relief. We can't spend that. Or yeah, inflation is this, but we can't afford that. Or we might go, you know what, there are such extraordinary needs, we're gonna need to come in above inflation as we did this past year. And we need to explain what those needs are. So it sort of gives you a jumping off point from that. Once you know what the number is, you can then back into what the budgets are. First thing you gotta spend is debt service, because that's a legal requirement. And then the rest gets divided 75% Board of Ed, 25% town generally. And then you get into a levy change, which is not the same as a tax increase, and we'll get to that in a second. But to I think Todd's point and Art's point, or each's point, there are always things that we don't anticipate. The first thing is Board of Selectmen and Board of Education goals, to Bert's point. Those are the boards charged with deciding what the community wants. It's taxpayer dollars, so what do they wanna spend their money on? Some people want this, I want this, I'm willing to pay for it. We are obligated, to Bert's point, what is our job? Our job is to protect the long-term fiscal health of the town, not from the perspective of any one project or department, but overall. Best practices, peer mill rates, public audience and feedback. I think I changed my mind based on the feedback that I heard. Community sentiment for and against a tax increase, we're seeing that play out right now in Avon and Canton. Affordability, state and federal mandates, fixed costs, legal obligations, public safety, timing of funding, alternate funding sources, efficiencies, responsible use of reserves, performance measures, and other. So these are, I pulled all these things because these are things we've evaluated in the past. There may be other things, but this is where this is why it's not a formula, and why there is judgment that gets played and why we're actually elected. So it is an iterative process. We would like it to be more, I think our lives would be easier if it was formulaic, but it's not. It's just, that's local government, and it's political in the best sense. It's about the push-pull of what we want as a society. But if you take that, I had Amy just run a couple scenarios, what does that mean, you know, at 3%, but think about tax levy is 387. Then Amy, if you could go to what it means for, if you apply that backwards into the budgets, what would that mean?
3% tab.
I'm sorry, what?
You want the 3% tab.
Where is it show? Can you go down to the tax increase? So then you get into about a 3% tax increase. So tax levy is higher, but because we had grand list, you get into a lower tax increase. And then you, to Todd's point, we look at that and we go, you know what, I'm comfortable with it or I'm not. And if I'm not, you know what, grand list needs to be applied to get that lower. Or Mark or Matt comes in and said, I have this need, I've got to make it, and our community really wants it. We need to come in a little bit higher, but it gives us a jumping off point. It's pretty much what we do, it's just changing the focus to the tax levy. Alright, you wanna give some color on that or add to that?
I don't know if there's much to add. I mean, I think you covered it up pretty well. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts here, and in some ways, I think we can almost overcomplicate it is the one thing I would say. And in the end, the math still comes back to sort of your inflation assumption and your grand list growth. Right, so I think the one-offs are always important. and I sort of, the way I think about it is, I'm fine to say it's not a formula, but I don't want that to imply that like there's still not numbers and targets and bogeys that we should be thinking about. Cause if you take it too far, say it's not a formula, someone says, well, that means I can just go bottoms up and kind of do whatever I want. I don't think that's right either. And I'm not implying anyone does that, right? But I think that having some of that discipline that would come out of, you know, a target like this, I think is definitely a good thing. And actually, one thing I didn't address that Mike brought up earlier that I worry about a little bit is you noted, Lisa, that the budget was passed, but maybe by slightly less than it had been on like a 5-year average or something, which I don't wanna oversteer for, but it was a year that we had a lot of special interest stuff coming up, so it makes me wonder, and I'm sort of extrapolating now what you were saying, Mike, was it a lot of special interest people that went and voted, right? Now, it was a fair vote, so I don't want to imply we shouldn't respect the vote was the vote, but at the same time, that's just something in the back of my mind is like in a year where maybe we didn't have as much special interest stuff, what would that vote have looked like?
One of the things that is not in sort of the analysis, but it really impacts budgets, less so than tax levy, is non-tax revenue. So if you see a lot of non-tax revenue increase, you can spend more on your budgets. This past year, we saw a huge decrease because of the motor vehicle, which is why the budgets were a little bit harder to get passed this year. So we don't think that's gonna happen, although Amy, there is new motor vehicle, I sent you guys email, a new motor vehicle assessment rule that was passed that we think is gonna stay, and that could result in a reduction of motor vehicle revenue, which would then push some of the costs to the real estate and increase taxes there, so that's one thing we may. But last year was I think for your first year, I'm sorry you guys had to go through that, a huge loss in revenue and a huge need increase on special education. We have now budgeted fully the education needs, and we should not see as dramatic a revenue loss, although there might be a little, because we'll have to see how that plays out. So it should be a little bit steadier, just in terms of when looking back over time, almost always, except for 2 times last year and then with Governor Malloy, we come in with our tax increase below the COLA, Social Security COLA. And we do that intuitively, that just makes sense. Seniors living on a fixed income, that's all they get. We wanna keep this town affordable for people living on a fixed income, we always do that, and that has been our guiding post really for decades. Speaking for all boards of finance, so that I would like to see us return to that as a guidepost. We weren't able to do it this last year, and that was hard, I think, for this board. But those are sort of things to think about it, but as we go through the analysis, we'll start to see, okay, what do the revenues look like? And the revenues are a normal inflationary increase in grand list. Sometimes you need to spend more than the revenues are, sometimes you need to spend less because we're trying to reach another goal. Like we wanna invest in capital, or we need to get our mill rate back in line. So those are the things. Todd, you look like you got something to say.
There is something I wanna say and I'm not sure how to say it. I mean, this seems like a kind of a top-down approach. You know, I feel like we've always done kind of bottom up, we let them, the other boards say, you know, here's kind of what ideally would be. I just feel like, and this might be a bias of where I've been for the last 12 years. Another reason that we need to be careful about having people leave town is because we make cuts into our services and what people feel are important. So I fear that this kind of approach could cut into things that are also important to people. But I'm not suggesting that you're not saying, you know, 2.94, we're done.
Right.
You're not saying that. You've repeated that number of times. You know, we talk about the guidance, we talk about the work that we do together. There are certain investments that we need to make sure that this stays a place that people can come to and people wanna stay. You know, talk about how hard it was with all the different levers. That's why we're here and that's why we have a conversation, and that's why it goes on for months and months and months, because it's not that easy. And I fear that this is it feels too simplistic, but I understand let's have a starting point.
It's a starting. So
Um,
when you said that it's not how we did it last year, this is almost identical to how we did it last year. As you recall, we met and we said, okay, 175 is your budget target.
Did I say that that's not how we did it last year?
That's what I heard. Maybe you didn't. Okay.
If that's what I said, that's not what I meant, 'cause
Okay.
well, no, last year, I mean, in years past, sometimes we've had a hard number that we've given to the Board of Ed. Sometimes it's been like, let's see. You know, this past year, we're like, this is kind of where we wanna be. We gave a number
Right.
and Board of Selectmen was one side of it, Board of Ed was collectively it was well, we had those conversations.
Well, I view that as the same conversation, just turning it around towards the tax levy. It wasn't meant to change sort of the back and forth. It just gives the starting point. Here's where we think the revenues are. Here's our starting point. Can you do this? If you can't, tell us why. And let's have that conversation back and forth and see where the public.
Yeah, I mean, we're all at the tri-board, right? We're all there and everybody in the room is, where are we headed, right? And for us to be able to not just go, well, CPI or COLA is coming in around 3.1, so we'd like you to be somewhere around there. But to go, you know, based on X, Y, Z, whatever, this is the number that we're hoping for, right?
That we're starting with before we
Starting,
have all the
hoping for,
information.
or that's it, right? If we wanna go there, which I don't wanna go there, you don't wanna go there, I don't think anybody on this board wants to go there. Boards in the past have done that, and I don't think we need to rule with an iron fist, if you will. But I like this approach in that, you know, I get why we used the CPI COLA number, because it's an easy number that everybody can look up, and it's, you know, there's some weight behind that. But I still like the idea of us doing our own due diligence and backing that number with something other than, well, it's CPI.
Well, it's more a framework for the discussion as to how we get, and we don't have to be unanimous. I mean, each of us may
That's fair.
view it differently and do it, but it's getting a framework as to like, well, how did you come up with that? Well, we looked at inflation, we looked at grand list. And this is how we got there, got it, don't have all the information, we don't know what the governor's budget, we don't know what your goals are. This is not like a business where you spend what the revenues you have. The revenues are bottomless, you can reach into people's pockets forever, right? As long as they're willing to pay. Do we wanna do that? Probably. Our citizens are telling us no. But there is the back and forth, and just if you think about the timeline of when we get information and why the information changes, you know, in July, we're gonna get our first information, we're gonna get the bonding agency report on the fiscal state of the town. We know what our debt service is, we know what our peer town mill rates are. In September, we'll get the fiscal year 2024 closeout numbers, so we'll know how much capital reserves are available for next year's budget. October 10th is the Social Security COLA is announced. That doesn't come out until October 10th. Projections are 3%. We get the quarterly report and updated grand list. In October or November, we get the tri-board and we get our first fixed cost estimates. And really, as I don't remember who said that, but salary does drive a lot of the budget. Then we get our audit results in January. We get CPI for December is announced in January. We get a quarterly report and trends. In February, we finally get the grand list finalized. It's no longer an estimate. We get the governor's budget, we have the superintendent's budget and the town manager's budget. So we start to evaluate the needs. Then it goes to the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Ed in March. Then we get public feedback. And I don't wanna underestimate the importance of public feedback. And we're all elected to respond to that. And it's their money, so. And then we get the quarterly report with year-end projections, which really is a crucial piece, which is why and that usually can't be done until mid-April. And a couple of unknowns that we wait on that are huge budget drivers are the health insurance increase, the ARC estimates, the utility estimates, and of course the special education reimbursement rate. So all these things go into the budget and require the back and forth. It's one, what can we afford, what do we need? And they're not always compatible, but we try working with the other boards, get to a place where we get a budget that meets what the town needs, but that's also both affordable to our residents and something that we think they're willing to support. And so far, they have been willing to support what we put forward, because it goes back to the question, what am I getting? And I say, are you willing to pay this much more? And the answer I get, well, what do I get for it? And if you have a good answer for that, sometimes the answer is, yeah, I am willing to pay for that. I want the best education. I bought my house here because of that. I'm willing to pay a little bit more for that. That's the value quality. But then you get to the other point, but when does that stop? If your mill rate is so much higher and Avon has the same quality education, so that's where the judgment calls come in, I guess is how I see it. But I think you're right, Todd, that when we communicate, it's not an iron fist. It's just a framework to start the evaluation, and as information comes in, we can go back and forth and go, oh, yeah, we need to come in a little higher than inflation because our negotiations came in higher than inflation, or we can come in a little lower than inflation because our negotiations came in a little lower than inflation.
A metal bridge that we water every day is rusting.
And we need to fix that.
Shocker.
And we wanna fix that. So I think it just is a basis for discussion, always knowing, you know, what are the revenues looking like and where do we wanna push them or pull them back? And then that's where the conversation with the other boards and the public really sort of starts to interact. And Wendy, do you have any thoughts on, you know, process or how you see this?
So I made some notes, it's kind of disjointed because of everything that I heard here. So one of the things I kind of think, well, first of all, the guidance, the whole aspect of giving us guidance, it does give us something to work with, but we're getting it before we've had a chance to look at the needs of the town and to meet as a board and discuss our priorities for the town. So it puts us kind of in a bind. I think guidance is helpful as long as there's kind of that exception clause that if we do find something that maybe, you know, the board agrees to, we are able to make the case for that, right? So I think guidance is good as long as there is an exception to the guidance that we can work with. And we've had a chance, because again, you're before we know what's going on. The whole public piece, I hear a lot of different things. I have to be honest with you, the public hearing, public audience, public hearing, it's always a biased case. It's always people with the special interests and not everybody else. So that's all we're hearing, and it's frustrating to me to not hear from other people, right? You guys also, I think everybody pretty much said that. But going to Todd's point, you know, we're catering to the people that maybe can't afford the taxes here. You know, we all have different levels of affordability, but there's other people that are willing to pay that much taxes. So how do you even that out and represent who are we representing? Who's in the community? Those are a few things that I have. And then another, really these are, and then the town comparison thing. You know, it's hard to compare us to all these towns because I don't know what they're offering to their residents. So you're telling me, you know, Avon's struggling with this. Do we do better than Avon? And that's why you're paying more to live here, because we offer more, we have a nicer community, we have a much more, you know, everybody voted yes for the budget. Versus South Windsor's not in our community, but we may be more comparable to them and their taxes were higher than ours, right? So that's another factor here, just sticking to those towns. I think those are my key points that I came to while you guys were talking. My last point is we always deal as a board of selectmen with the Board of Ed getting higher preference because their needs are greater than ours because they have to meet state requirements for education. So we need all this, we have to have this, blah, blah, blah. And then we're kind of left with, we have to make up this much. So if there is a fair guidance to both teams, that would be helpful too, that we feel like we're getting a good chunk and they're getting a good chunk, so.
Yeah, so couple responses there. Our job by state law and statutory, by case law, is to view the budgets not from the perspective of any one department. Your job is to view it from the Department of Board of Selectmen, the education of the educate. That's statutorily, you're required to do that. Our job is to do it from the perspective of the whole. So just like with a child, my children get mad at me, well, you gave him this, but I got this. It's like, he got what he needed, you got what you needed, right? And so equal is not always equal. You wanna try and give each what they need. And so that's why it's not always identical. We do try and do it, and it's generally been 75-25%. But it's not always. There were extraordinary expenses with the Board of Ed this year that we saw across the state. But one of the things we're gonna look into is statistics, over time. And just, I mentioned to Mark, I'd forward that, if you look back in 2016, the amount of budget that went to the Board of Ed was higher than it is now. And so the question is why? What happened? And was that intentional? Is that where we wanna go? Maybe it's declining enrollment, but to sort of look at those trends. And the other thing, one of the things I'm gonna be asking Amy for is, what do budget increases percent in dollars look like for the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Ed, to just your point. But to ask Amy to do it in a way that neutralizes some of the one-time extraordinary expenses. In 2018, the Board of Selectmen budget went up 15% because we had to add 2.5 million for Malloy. If you pull that out, the increase is more apples to apples. We did a one-time on the Board of Selectmen, I can't remember when we did this in 20 or 21, there was a one-time infusion of cash for capital that got added to the Board of Selectmen. It was planned to go away the next year. So it looks like there was a huge spike and then a huge decrease. So you pull that out. Like with ARPA, huge increase, right? 3.5 million, but if you pull that out, Mark's increase was 3.5. It looked like his budget went down by a tremendous amount, but it didn't. It was actually an increase of 349. So once you pull out those sort of extraordinary factors to try and get an apples to apples comparison, let's take a look at that, because I think, Wendy, you raise a good point. Are we funding the priorities of the town? And if budgets are our values, how are we funding? Where are we going? And is this the direction we wanna go into? So that's a nice sort of segue into what data we should be looking at in terms of trends, going forward. I just mentioned too, I've forwarded a list earlier. I don't know if that folks have had a chance, or if there's other things they wanna add to it. Some of this data is really readily available. We have OPM's fiscal indicators, we have EdSite, we actually have the back section of our annual required report has stats in it. So some of this information is super accessible. To Wendy's point, I don't know what we're offering to what other people. We don't have a lot of performance indicators in our budget. So you can't do that comparison. That's why they're so important. The public needs to know what they're getting and how we're measuring success, right? So that's one thing, that's, an overtime long objective. I know Amy and Melissa have started working on that. We're starting to get some performance measures, but to the extent we can build that up, we can say, hey, we're getting this town is not. We're getting this, your money is paying for this town is not. It helps you do the value analysis. Am I getting the most value? Chris Kelly used to always tell me, we get above average services at below average costs. And that's why it's great to live in Simsbury. That was always his goal, above average service, below average cost. And to try and deliver what the citizens want, because people are willing to pay a little bit more to live in Simsbury. But how much more? That's sort of what is the tipping point?
Yeah, and I'd like to speak to that, returning to the point I made earlier about the role of the Board of Finance. Technically, as you expressed it, we have to determine or assess the budget in terms of the long-term fiscal health of the town, but that is a pretty vague description. And to me, I do attend the budget workshops, and I understand there are policy decisions. There are a lot of individual policy decisions that go behind every allocation and every line item. But each one of them contributes to the total budget, and the amount of the total budget, this number that that new Art has been pounding the table on, really represents a policy decision about who can afford to live in the town, what level of services, to Todd's point, what level of services is justifiable, or to what extent are we simply selling people a lot of amenities based on solely on their ability to pay. And that affects not just the finances of individual households, but it means it determines what kind of community we're living in, who our neighbors are, and how we relate to them. And to the extent the Board of Finance has a role, it's bringing that perspective, that policy question, which relates to every single line item in both the Board of Selectmen budget and the Board of Education budget, to bear on how the aggregate comes out. And that's why I think it's worthwhile for us to say, $108 million, $112 million is pretty much all we think we can expect to pay. Yes, every year there are gonna be surprises, but to the extent that we simply say, all right, we take last year's budget, but we've had some unpleasant surprises, so we're justified in spiking it this year. We hope it'll turn out better next year. We hope the rest of the town's future for the next 20 years is going to level out. That's not how it should go. We need to, and so we now have a town manager. Last two have talked to us about zero-based budgeting. That's what this means. This means we evaluate each year's budget in terms of how much we can afford to spend. Are we asking too much from the town? Are we changing the character of the town? And that's why I think the level of information we generally get from the Board of Selectmen is useful. I would like to see more of that information on that level from the Board of Education so that we can make those judgments. But I think it is our role to give that kind of guidance, to remind everybody, because as classic art has pointed out over and over again, when I sit through those budget workshops, I hear presentation about a lot of different expenditures and say, wow, that's a really good idea. Our job would be easy if all the spending proposals were stupid and we could just knock them down. They're not, but we need to bring a separate perspective to those proposals in order to figure out what the best mix is under all these different scenarios, all these different variables that members of this board have just been discussing. And to do that, we have to suggest that that keeping this number within a manageable range each year is every bit as significant a priority as anything else that the boards are proposing. So that's what I have to say.
Two other just really quick points. I think that first of all, I'll maybe 3 points then. I think the slightly different viewpoints that we have, to me in some ways it's healthy, and this is what government should do, like we're representing different viewpoints, so I think that's great. It almost just feels like each of us has a slightly different starting point, but we all are acknowledging to respect the other side, which I think is great. I feel like the thing that we haven't said though, and because I think Lisa, to one of the points you said, it's almost like pay less to get more kind of thing. I forget what the phrase that you used, but I feel like it has in it an efficiency element to it, because you don't pay less to get more unless you're creative, right? And I think the way you get creative is you have some framework, right? And it doesn't mean, again, it's not a formula, it's not, oh my God, I have to hit this number every year. But without that, without having some push there, you sort of need an equal and opposite force. I'll use special ed as something that came up a lot this year that I know we've had a lot of conversations about. I think at some point when that number gets so big, you should have economies of scale to start thinking about how can I deliver special ed in a different way so every single person isn't just adding another teacher. And I know there's some thought that's going into that right now, which is great, but we probably need to have that thought in a few other places if we wanna spend less to get more, right? So I think you have to have some framework, because without that, I don't know about you guys, but if I don't have a goal, I don't know what I'm shooting for, right? So I think getting that right is really important. The other thing is, and I think again, we're all coming at this a little bit differently, but to me, there's like this range within which our constituents are okay, and you step out on either side of that range and it's not good. You either don't have good services and they say what's going on, or you overspent them and now they say, well, I think I'm spending too much money, I will go to Avon, I will go to whatever, Glastonbury or Farmington or whatever it is. when I look at the numbers and I look at what we've done with special interest and stuff, I think we're at more risk on that other side of this. I don't think we're at the risk of the side of, I just don't hear people coming to me and saying, man, this town doesn't have enough stuff. I think it's the opposite, where we run more of a risk now that we're on the upper edge of these things. Like, and again, that doesn't mean we start peeling it back tomorrow and try to get inside of Avon, but at the same time, I'm just more arguing like, let's not let that gap get any wider. I think like, I could maybe get caught with someone in Fitzgerald's and explain that you pay 10% more to live in Avon in the same, value house. If I got to 15 or 20, I think I'd have a hard time having that conversation, as much as I love our town. So just maybe a little bit of additional color to some of the stuff you're talking about.
And the other thing we haven't really talked about, in all of this forecasting fun stuff is our, how do we also keep a lens on our aging infrastructure, right? All of our schools are 50, 60 years old, save the Build As New Latimer project, which, was just completed. And obviously, more in the elementary side than the high school and the middle school, but we have some pretty significant infrastructure that is coming down the line at us. I know we've started preparing for some of that fun stuff, but that needs to stay somewhere in our plan too.
So a couple things I heard, and I'm gonna draw it down to something that I hope you will appreciate. The first question is, do you start with the budget or do you start with the needs? And in a town budget, it's unlike a home budget. When you renovate your kitchen, you don't go to the contractor, I need this, and he says, okay, here's what it's gonna cost. You go, I can't afford that. You always start with your budget. Here's my budget, here's what I'd like, here's what I can do. The town, it is a little bit different because we're not a business and we're not a home value. So that is a consistent conflict. In terms of who do we budget to, I think, Bert and Wendy make good points, and we're gonna have different perspectives on there. My perspective, I think people have known, I've been in local government for 15 years, I budget to the least among us, cause I think we're judged by how we treat those who are least. But not everyone agrees with that. I've certainly heard other people disagree with that. But it all drives down to Art's stool. It really is the balance between the town, the Board of Education, and affordability. And it is not, and if any one of those is out of whack, we've failed. And that's where the conversation comes back to. And that's why this is politics. This is why this is civic engagement, because there is no easy answer. We do have to take into account capital needs. We do have to take into account other needs, and we do have to take into account affordability. So in some ways, it's the same process we've always used, but trying to at least show how we're each thinking about it, and we may think about it differently, and that's okay. At the end of the day, we've got to get the votes, and it's gonna take 4 votes to get a budget, and so we'll get there. They have not always been unanimous, but they've always been civil. And that's sort of my goal, is to try and get there and try and figure out what is that right balance, cause it's not an easy answer. And Wendy's might think that it's out of balance, town isn't getting enough, education might think, I'm not getting enough. And members of our board may think, I'm not sure our citizens can afford this. So I think we passed a budget that none of us loved, but all of us could accept and were felt proud of, and that would meet the needs and that was relatively affordable.
And it did pass almost 2-1.
It did.
So, I mean, that's a message from the public as well, and people think that it was because certain special interest groups came out. That's
fair though.
They came out.
Yeah, they came out.
I know we did a lot of hand wringing. I mean, 4.68 was still a big number for us, but the public did say yes. Maybe next year, if we do a 4.68 again, they're gonna say, you had your yes last year. So, to R. Wallace's point, let's aim for something that we don't need to do that again, and see where that takes us.
By the way, I was not suggesting that we're at 3%
No,
inflation. This was just an example where you don't have COLA, we don't have anything.
I used 3% to
Yeah.
continue the illustration.
Yes, it was just for the illustration. I'm not in any way
No,
saying that
that's-
that's
It might be,
it might be.
it might be, it might not be.
Right. So, but those are the numbers that will, for members of the public, you'll see us discussing tax levy, inflation,
Yeah.
grand list growth and needs
Just
with multiple boards.
out of curiosity, is there any way to roll back the clock a year and see what that 2.9 would have been if you did the same math from last year to this year?
Yeah, we can do that.
I mean, that,
Can you pull that
it
back
would just
up,
be
last
interesting to
year's
see
budget?
what,
Start with the previous year's
I'm
tax
sure it's not gonna be
levy.
that much different from where it ended up. With the 2.94, but just
So if we did last year's tax levy, did the inflationary increase of 3.2 because that was what COLA was. And then we had no grand list. We had 40,000 in grand list, right, Amy?
easier and see how far off from that
Yeah.
initial bogey.
It's a good suggestion.
But your tax levy is still the same, you just don't have.
No, if we had said to them, you can spend more on your tax levy, you get the inflation and you get plus 50,000, that's what you can spend.
It's gonna be like 3.2, right?
And then what does that get us to for, and then put the budgets back into the budget, what would the budget have been if the tax levy is 112,873?
Is this the right question?
Oh, that messes up the formula, hold on.
You kinda gotta figure out what was the dollar increase of the 3.2% off of the old levy.
I mean, I don't need to see now, I just
No, now it's a challenge, Todd.
So Amy, the total amount we could increase spending would be 3,390,456 if you do the 3% plus the 50,000 in grand list growth,
3,390,000.
456. And then figure out,
Isn't it just gonna bring
Wait.
back to 3.2?
Yeah, because you're adding it to the
no, so what,
tax levy.
the total amount they can spend is, the budget increase is 3,390.
Right.
So it's bringing it down $1 million, it would have brought it down $1 million. So if we decrease the budgets by $1 million, what would the tax increase have been?
If you decrease the budgets by $1 million?
Yeah,
Be a little less than a percent decrease, so it'd be like, instead of 468, it would have been like 3.8 or something.
would be close to that. Which is
Which is closer to,
where we all want it to be.
yeah, no, I mean, that's
Which is why,
that helps me give perspective on kind of
Yeah.
our plan and
yeah,
the starting point.
yeah, that's that's kind of a reasonable goal. Whether we can make it or not will involve the back and forth. And whether we wanna come in below that goal may be a function of where our mill rate is. Maybe not next year, but maybe the year after. I mean, those are trends, in the
That's right.
past, I know that I was part of a budget where the mill rate discrepancy was too large over time, and we worked with the Board of Finance over like 5-year period, coming in below our neighbors so that we could get that competitive. That took years, it took half a decade to get that back. We've now,
Well, that's not lost on me, and that's part of the reason why
Right.
we need to be ahead of this, because
right,
if you all of a sudden find yourself at 15% over Avon and you wanna pick up that 5%, that will take 5 or 6 years.
it takes 5 to 6 years, but it was incredibly hard budgeting. And I remember one year I came in with a 3.3% budget and I thought it was not gonna pass the Board of Finance. And I really had, I mean, that was because there was a time when there was very focused among the 3 boards, we need to be competitive with our neighbors. We're not offering services that are that much better than our neighbors. But to Wendy's point, it would be helpful to look at performance measures, look at, what are we offering? What is and where do we find that? Is there any one place where we have that? I mean, that's a helpful communication piece.
You'd have to put together like an index, right? Cause you'd have to look at how our schools are ranked, you'd have to look at a whole bunch of different things. It's almost like a happiness
And the
variable.
challenge there, right, is it's never going to be apples to apples.
No.
Right?
And
No.
never the same for everybody.
Happiness, you can't
You know what it
bring
is?
happiness.
You know what it is? It's getting more people to come out and vote and have them vote. Like that's-
I love it, right? So Canton 23.2%, Avon so far around 18%, and we got 10%. I didn't look up Glastonbury or
They voted-
Farmington.
and
voted
they-
the budgets down,
and
so
they
that's the
lost.
last
I
time.
mean,
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Understood, right? More numbers doesn't always potentially mean a better thing, but I just wearing that sticker and asking, being asked why I was wearing it, it wasn't an old shirt that I hadn't washed in a long time, it was a
I'd rather
fresh
win,
shirt.
I'd rather
fresh
win.
There's that too.
There's revenue differentials too between.
I wanna win too, but I
There's
want real
revenue,
competition.
There's grand list, our grand list, per capita grand list is the lowest among our peer towns. So that's one of Mark's top priorities, that we've got, Mark always says we have a revenue problem, and I always respond, we've got a revenue and an expenditure problem, because I'm the Board of Finance, but it is a combination of both, and the fact is, we do have that data, it's in the municipal fiscal indicators, it's in EdSite, there's a lot of data, but capturing it in a way that we can communicate it is very hard. So we were trying to get into, how we do that. The educational profile I shared, that'll come out again in July, so you can start to do the comparisons with other towns. But one of the ways, and I have talked with Sarah Nielsen, she's gonna bring in some real estate agents to talk about trends. Cause one of the best ways to judge how we're doing is who wants to move here. If people are willing to write the check to move here, that's an indicator of how we're doing. That's at least one indicator. But to Bert's point, it's an indicator of those with money. And how do we care for those who don't, which is why this board is super focused on tax relief for seniors, Mark. So
Ironic.
I know that's your priority to look at that, and I appreciate that, and Wendy.
Wendy's working.
So that's part of the balance, how do you do that? So the answer at the end of the day is we don't know, and we might not agree, but all of us are thinking about factors in one way or another, and some of us have more flexibility than others in moving off what revenue assumptions are, and that's not atypical in boards of finance. But that's where, to Bert's point, having the data will help us make the decisions. And having the conversations with the other boards, cause we value that in the public. Right, Mark, did you have anything you wanna think about or add to that?
Just made a lot of notes and in no particular order. I just wanna say I've been doing municipal budgeting for a large part of my career. And kudos to this board for being reflective and very empathetic with your taxpayers, because that really is at the crux of why I think, I haven't been here that long, but I think the one thing I didn't hear tonight was that maybe you couldn't say it, but I can. I think there's a large amount of trust among your taxpayers in this board. And I think that the reflective consideration of what we've talked about tonight, and I hope, to your point about turnout, I hope everybody watches tonight's meeting. I think is gonna be very pivotal. The discussion is really important. I think I love the model that Art put up there. In Poughkeepsie, our budget was about 112 million, so very similar, although we didn't have the Board of Ed. But dollar for dollar was about the same. And we started there in 2016 with a 13.2 million general fund deficit, mostly due to two-twos, two-froms across funds and a total disaster. And over the ensuing 8 years, we eliminated that deficit while we increased spending on the key things that we needed to do. And even putting aside ARPA, we were able to budget every year, and 7 out of 8 years were a surplus in the general fund while we right-sized government. But the other two things I wrote down here, which I think were just touched on briefly, were efficiency is really key, and we're starting to look at that. And with efficiency, in other words, you're gonna hear, I think, more from us on the administrative side is innovation. Because a lot of the low-hanging fruit, our department heads have already done that. I mean, I've had time to review our budget. This was my first budget, I learned a lot. There isn't a lot of fat there to cut unless you're in dire straits and you've gotta start, hurting programs and services. But there hasn't been as much innovation, and there hasn't been as much efficiency in government. I think that's where, frankly, we have opportunity. And that how you factor that into the equation is, and how do you quantify that? I'm a little more focused on realizing those efficiencies and convincing our electeds to buy into some innovation, which you'll be hearing about, whether it's on the special ed side that some of you are aware of, or whether it's on policies and procedures that can save us money. Frankly, I'll just confess, I'm a little more interested in that than I am in, with respect, 10-year lookbacks. And I think we can have further discussions about the data requests that we see. I think, from a resource allocation perspective, one of my tasks is to make sure that, particularly in finance, we can meet the needs for information and data while we're still meeting our objectives in terms of timely audits and, starting our budget process earlier and managing a conversion to ClearGov. And our new HR module is gonna be implemented this year too, and some of the changes that this board and Wendy's board has approved, we're gonna start realizing the benefits from that. So I wanna just thank you for that. But I will tell you one more thing. I have never, ever missed guidance. Never missed it. 8 years in Hartford, managed the budget every year. Now, I was only responsible for the revenue side, not the entire budget. But never missed a budget, and I never will. So if you give me guidance, I'm gonna hit that guidance. And the last thing I wanna say is thank you very much in this previous process, because, and I think a couple of you mentioned this, you didn't move the goalposts. At least on the municipal side, I wasn't paying as much attention as I hope to next time on the board side, but you gave us guidance on the municipal side and we worked hard to get there. And essentially what I heard was if we meet that guidance, then we don't need to get into necessarily the $1,000 level of each individual budget item. And lastly, to Wendy's point about how we did the Board of Selectmen process and did that public meeting, we had all the same people in the room with all the same data. The only thing that I chose to do differently was, instead of organize it by department and essentially ask all of our other department heads to sit in a meeting that could have been many hours while somebody else goes first, second, third, fourth, and fifth, we jumbled it all up so that we did capital, CNR, operating, and that resulted in all of our department heads having multiple touches during the day. And there were multiple opportunities for elected board members to hit them with questions. Sometimes, and you know this in your own roles, you don't think of that question immediately when Tom Roy is standing in front of you, but you get it, immediately afterwards. And so I thought there was a better dialogue, frankly, in terms of the Board of Selectmen review process. And obviously, we also asked, and I appreciate what this board did and what Wendy's board did, to get us our questions in advance. So we can start the process earlier, we can get as much data to you as possible, but we really appreciate the collaboration That's a word I knew, I heard a lot tonight, and I just wanna tell you that it was a very collaborative process. And I appreciate it when you give us guidance and that's what we take to how we get there. It's kind of our problem on the administrative side with your input, especially on the capital side. But we're gonna hit your guidance, and the sooner we get it, the easier it is. So we wanna help you give us that guidance and give you the data. You haven't sold me yet, Chair, on a 10-year look back. I just looked at this and I'm happy to have a sit down with you and any of your colleagues that wanna.
So I'll just say, you know,
Yeah.
from the Board of Finance, we have expressed, and correct me if I'm not speaking for the board, to do data-driven decision making, and you
Sure.
cannot do that without data. And both the charter and the state law do permit us to request data and to receive the data that we need to do our job. So we will have conversation with, and I had mentioned with Amy, I'm happy to have a conversation, some of that is easy, but some of it is hard, and if it's too hard to get, we would want to know what resources you would need to get it, and then we'll make our decision whether to spend
Right.
those resources. But some of it's very easy, like trends, what have been the increase in cost for the last 10 years? We can do that.
I'll
What's
give
the
you one,
percentage?
if I may, I'll give you one quick example. It isn't a question of the date, it's a question of the time of look back. So with respect, for example, to employee benefits, if the board asks, as I think you did, for a breakdown of benefits by department, it can be done. We can't easily do it, but Lockton, who's handled all of our benefits, as you know, has been on our payroll for about 6 years. So if we could, in those discussions, Chair, reduce the 10-year look back to 6, it becomes a whole lot easier for me to say to Lockton, I need all of this data and we get it quickly. So little things like that, I'd love to chat with you more
Absolutely.
and just have an opportunity.
And you may not, I talked with Amy in the past, we have tried to look at benefits by department, and in fact, Avon puts the benefits in the departments, and it is not an easy look back. So I said to Amy, I don't know that you can get us that, but she was gonna look at that, because it is helpful to know what we're spending by departments. And we don't know that, because we segregated
I would just say, and I agree with that, except the benefit cost increases are probably, I won't say the most, but it's one of those that we have the least impact and ability to alter, right? So we get that number when it comes in and we live with it generally. So in that respect, the look back of 10 years to me, I would focus on other areas. That's just one of the conversations.
So to me, that's one of our biggest drivers, and that goes to the health, you know, when is the last time we went out to bid for Con Health? That's, you know, it would be helpful to understand what is driving the budgets, and that's why that look back is helpful.
Agreed.
When we get OpenGov, that's standard. You can, they plug in what data and you can see 10-year look back. You just push a button for the public. So I think once we get that developed, it will be easier. We used to have a program where we did use that. We've stopped using it. It wasn't as lovely as the program you guys are pursuing. But you could just push a button. What have we spent on overtime the last 10 years? What
That's
have we
right.
spent? There's AI now that will do that. You just have to get up the data. It's not as complicated as it used to be, especially when that's fully integrated.
Oh, Chair, just one other thing on Art's model, if I can. How, and maybe we can have conversations offline about what happens when, and this is a good problem to have, your grand list growth is back up to doing the sorts of things that you want it to do. In that situation, a tax increase is not gonna be COLA plus your grand list, but
Right.
some portion of your grand list growth, I'm sure this board is looking at whether it's mitigating debt service or tax relief or whatever, but closing that gap between us and say Avon is a multi-year process. This board could direct us, in addition to the guidance, to make sure that we incrementally make progress towards that goal. If you set that as one of our goals, we will do our best to achieve that.
Oh, we will absolutely do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was not, I mean, I looked at comparables because of course, at least you and Amy and others brought that up, but I was more of a bottom up on my first budget, but I think we will be very aware and cognizant of what our peer communities are doing. One last thing, to Michael's point, the collective bargaining situation. Also would love to, when we have our executive session, meeting on the GovHR classification study, that might be an opportunity, Chair, for me to brief you on some of the collective bargaining that's ongoing right now.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful, and then we can have those conversations. For members of the public, they may not realize the Board of Selectmen budget, 70% is driven by salaries and benefits, Board of Ed 85%.
Yeah.
So
Big numbers. Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity to comment.
You're welcome. Are there any other comments on the budget discussion at this point? Okay, we did see data, please take a look at, and if you have other things, we will have conversations with Amy, what she can easily access and what would take work, and then we can decide, is this something we want to Mark's point, whether we wanna do lesser look back and some. I think the 10-year look back on budget and percent increases is really important though, for one of them. Alright, so moving on. Minutes. Would anyone like to make a motion to, I sent my changes to Amy, that's already been updated, it was just minor, there was a gap on it.
I move that we approve the updated minutes
For May 14th and May 23rd?
for precisely those dates.
Okay.
I'll second that.
Is there any further discussion or changes in the minutes? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
I just know that I'd like to abstain on the last one, because I had to miss that meeting, but
Okay.
I approve the first one.
I move to adjourn.
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Any further discussion, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.